Welcome, welcome to another installment of The Goddess Keys, where we unleash and unlock the tools and the jewels to support us with returning back to the fundamental knowing that we all have, that we are God Goddess in form. Sometimes we just need some support with remembering. And today we're going to discuss activating the divine mind, polarity integration, embodying wholeness, or what some folks in the Ascension community refer to as Heros Gamos, which is basically the unification of the divine masculine and the divine feminine. But I am going to talk about it in a different way. I think a lot of times in the Ascension community, when we talk about the unification of the divine masculine and the divine feminine, we kind of go down that path of the twin flames, right? That's a big thing, reuniting with the twin flame. And I'm actually not questioning the validity of that in this particular conversation, and I'm also not questioning the validity of uniting with a sacred partner, but I would like to discuss the unification of the divine masculine and feminine through the brain and through the crown chakra. Because in order to transcend polarity consciousness, it does require a sacred marriage between the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere of the brain. Okay. So when we think about sacred marriage, that's a big piece of the alchemical process. And a lot of times we take it really literally, and we think about literally getting married to somebody and having somebody else complete us. But in all actuality, the unification of the divine feminine and the divine masculine always happens from within before it happens in our external reality. And if there is a unification with or if there is some sort of a partnership that emerges without that unification of the innermost divine masculine and divine feminine, then a lot of times there might be different forms of fragmentation or codependency that will emerge within that particular relationship. So let's talk about what sacred marriage looks like as we unify polarity from within. All right. So I am going to take y'all on a journey today to get to this concept of sacred marriage. And I'd say go grab some tea or your favorite kind of hot beverage, get cozy, and take a moment to be within this space. And if you can, bring your undivided attention to this space, okay? As we discuss the unification of the right hemisphere of our brain and the left hemisphere of our brain. So one thing about when we talk about the brain hemispheres, the right side of our body actually, as well as the right side of the brain, represents the inner male. So we all have an inner male or an inner female, no matter how we identify in terms of gender, in terms of our bodies. Okay, we have to remember that whatever body that we have, that is our vessel, but that is not who we are. We all have masculine and feminine energies within us that we are constantly balancing out, okay? So the right side of us represents our inner male. The left side of us represents our inner female, okay? Now, another thing to keep in mind is in this society, in this false matrix system, there has been an over prioritization on the male, okay, the masculine. And that's not to say that the masculine is bad. That's not to say that the masculine doesn't have a great amount of value. And yet the masculine kind of consciousness, first of all, has been inverted in a lot of ways, but has also been in a state of imbalance. Okay, and the feminine has been in a state of imbalance as well. So a big piece of the sacred marriage is the balance and equilibrium between the two, not valuing one over another, but balancing out those energies within us, okay? And in order to do that, then the polarity-based thinking and the polarity-based thought forms must be exercised from our consciousness to make this happen. The scales must be balanced from within. And as we balance out these energies, what we do is we move from a state of fragmentation to wholeness. We go through embodying wholeness. So something I just did on the Patreon in the month of October is we worked on a lot of different activities and practices around what I was calling the ultimate reversal spell, uncrossing ourselves, getting ourselves out of this weird like duality-based consciousness that's been perpetuated within the false matrix. And that duality-based consciousness, that sacrificial-based consciousness has been based upon dualism, us versus them. Somebody being the oppressor, somebody being the oppressed, somebody being the victimizer, and somebody being the victim, okay? So unity, wholeness, balance is impossible. Sacred marriage is impossible in that kind of paradigm. Yeah, you can get married. Yeah, you can be in a partnership, but it's going to be within a state of imbalance and fragmentation. So the unification of the divine masculine and the divine feminine and the cultivation of the divine mind must be done from a state of wholeness, okay? Holding balance for the all, holding honor for the all, okay? And that happens from within. So let's talk about polarity consciousness and how it shows up in our society. I'm going to start off with kind of like more of a third dimensional example and then just kind of roll with me. We're going to go multi-dimensional as we continue on. But I'm actually highlighting a concept from a person who was pretty big in terms like a pretty big intellectual back in the day, W.E.B. Du Bois. So he was a civil rights activist who was from the United States. He was also known as a Pan-Africanist. He did a lot. He actually helped to found the NAACP, okay, which was a very big, or I guess is a very big civil rights organization, okay? So walk with me here, roll with me, follow me just for a bit, okay? I'm going to tie a lot of stuff together. We're going from 3D to multidimensional, all right? You all ready? Okay, let's do this. So, in the early 1900s, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote about a concept called double consciousness in his book, The Souls of Black Folk, which was released in 1903. Very interesting title. So keep that in your mind. We're talking about the cultivation of the divine mind, the sacred marriage. And here's this intellectual. He was also one of the first, just some of his accomplishments outside of creating or supporting to create the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1909, and also editing a very popular civil rights magazine called The Crisis at the time. He also wrote The Souls of Black Folk, which was a huge book that was published and disseminated throughout many institutions of higher education. And he was also one of the first Black Americans to receive a PhD from Harvard University. Okay, so very highly accomplished. Now, he created this concept called, or coined this concept called double consciousness. And, I'm pulling up Wikipedia here. It says double consciousness is the dual self-perception experienced by subordinated or colonized groups in an oppressive society. So let's zoom out a bit. We're going multidimensional from 3D to multi-D right now. Okay, so just like when I mentioned in the download that I uploaded as it related to uncrossing ourselves to exit the false matrix, I utilize the example of slavery, okay, American chattel slavery. And I utilize the example of the 1800s version of slavery, okay? And when we think about the false matrix system, the system that we're exiting, the system that we're deprogramming, no matter what we look like, no matter how we appear, it is a slavery consciousness system, okay? It is a system based upon oppression, limitation, constriction, subjugation, all right? No matter who you are, if you are in the false matrix system, it is a program of sacrifice that you participate in. And even if you represent more of an elite or elevated class, quote unquote, within the false matrix, you are still enslaved within it, okay? And I utilize the concept of the house slave versus the field slave. So here were slaves that were pitted against each other. The house slaves were supposed to be the ones that had more of the privileges, had it better, supposedly, and then the field slaves had it more difficult. But at the end of the day, they both groups were slaves. They didn't have rights. Okay, so when we're in this duality consciousness, this double consciousness, as W.E.B. Du Bois referred to it as, there is still a system of oppression. All right. So now we're moving out of the example of slavery, and we're going to move into the social dynamics of oppression. Okay, and this is what W.E.B. Du Bois spoke to in the early 1900s in the United States. Even though slavery was supposedly abolished, there were still some very harsh conditions for Black the beings who were referred to as Black Americans. It's always hard to figure out the right name to call it because there's a lot of coded language and a lot of stuff. But for we're just going to say Black Americans right now, okay? So at this particular time, Black Americans were in a weird state of like just being emancipated and having really difficult time with different social pressures and conditions within society. And W.E.B. Du Bois, who was also, I just mentioned all of his credentials, okay? He wasn't the typical Black American at the time. As a matter of fact, he created and coined a term outside of double consciousness. He also coined a term called the talented 10th, which had to do with basically Black Americans who there were supposed to be a very select few Black Americans who were supposed to lead society or lead Black people, and they were known as being the top 10%, the Black Americans, also known as the talented 10th. And he definitely put himself in that category. Okay. And we'll get a little bit more into that and connect this all to the divine mind. Walk with me, y'all. Walk with me. Roll with me during this process. Okay. So let's get back to double consciousness. All right. It says he described the African American experience of double consciousness, including his own. Originally, double consciousness was specifically the psychological challenge African Americans experience of always looking at oneself through the eyes of a racist white society and measuring oneself by the means of a nation that looked back in contempt. So if we code this now or decode this actually as it relates to the false matrix system, this would be all of us are divine. I'm going to read a quote now as it relates to what W.E.B. Du Bois says about double consciousness. It says, "It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder." So once again, if we decode this in the false matrix system, if we take Du Bois's words written in the early 1900s and we decode this within this false matrix system, he mentions this sense of two-ness and like this sense of doubleness, this double-mindedness being pit against the same person, okay? And it kind of like tears you apart because you're not fully aligning with the wholeness of who you truly are. And instead you're getting into this like weird competition thought form, this weird small-mindedness, okay? Now, W.E.B. Du Bois would have been in some way considered more of a radical back in the 1900s. That being said, he was also pit against like other civil rights activists at the time, and maybe who would have been considered more radical. But if we think about the standard American, regardless of color, at that particular time, W.E.B. Du Bois had for his time, he had some radical ideas about race and about civil rights, being one of the founders of the civil rights movement in the United States after the Civil War. Okay. However, we have to think about this from double consciousness. That was one aspect of W.E.B. Du Bois's consciousness, was that. But let's talk about the other aspect of double consciousness. And once again, we're zooming out and we're taking a multidimensional approach as it relates to this concept of double consciousness and W.E.B. Du Bois. So one thing that maybe a lot of us don't know about is the role that secret societies played within the civil rights movement, within a lot of the quote unquote radical movements of the Americas in particular. So I'm going to talk about this from a little bit more of an American standpoint. So even though W.E.B. Du Bois was considered to be radical, he was also funded and elevated through secret societies. Okay, he actually was a founding member of the New York chapter of a secret society called the Boule, also known as Sigma Pi Phi. Okay, it was the Sigma Pi Phi fraternity. Okay, and so Boule in ancient Greece was known as Council of Chiefs. And it says it is the oldest continuously existing Greek letter postgraduate fraternity, originally founded by and primarily for eminent Black professional men and later similar professional men of African descent throughout the world. Its founders were 6 exceptional men, 4 medical doctors, 1 dentist, and 1 pharmacist, who at that time was a second-year medical school student. Okay. Now it says throughout its existence, its membership has included some of the most distinguished men in the world. They have included such scholars and academic, cultural, and civil rights leaders as W.E.B. Du Bois, Carter G. Woodson, founder of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, Charles R. Drew, physician who developed blood plasma, James Weldon Johnson, author of Lift Every Voice and Sing, which is also known as the Black National Anthem, L. Douglas Wilder, the first elected Black governor of a U.S. state, which was Virginia, and Martin Luther King Jr., founder of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and one of the most important 20th century civil rights leaders. There's also many other Black intellectuals and civil rights activists who were a part of the Boule, a very exclusive secret society, which is still in existence today. It has about 5,000 members today, and I'm not going to go into who those members are, but if you do your research, you will see some of the biggest movers and shakers within our society today who are also Black men. You're going to find them in the Boule, as members of the Boule. Why is this even a thing? Why am I talking about this? Okay, let's go back to W.E.B. Du Bois's concept of double consciousness, 2 warring souls. Remember, he named this very famous book of his, The Souls of Black Folk. Very interesting that he chose to focus in on the soul as it relates to this. let's talk a little bit more and dive a little bit more deeply as it relates to the Boule, this secret society. So this secret society was modeled after some of the white founded Masonic orders at that particular time, and Black Americans weren't allowed to be in those orders, and they wanted to have some kind of their own hierarchical system. Now, a lot of the information that you'll find on Google and stuff will kind of make it seem as though this was completely bootstrapped by Black Americans, right, who wanted to create their own place in the world. But that's actually not so. The Boule was very much funded by white secret societies at the time, okay? And that's important because a lot of the members of the Boule went on to be very prominent civil rights activists, civil rights leaders who in the public forefront were basically fighting against the power structures. But behind the scenes, they were being funded by these same power structures. Double consciousness. All right, let's go a little bit more multidimensional with this. So, an interesting tidbit, I find this really fascinating about the Boule. So, the name of the presiding member of the Boule, like the person in charge, the president, if you will, of the Boule, they are known to be an archon. They are called archons. So now I am on Wikipedia. Archon is a Greek word that means ruler, frequently used as the title of a specific public office. It is the masculine present participle of the verb stem, meaning to be the first to rule, derived from the same root as words such as monarch and hierarchy. Now, I mentioned this briefly earlier, but I'm just going to state it again. W.E.B. Du Bois was a founding member of the Boule for the New York chapter. So, for all intents and purposes, W.E.B. Du Bois may have been considered an archon. Why is this interesting? Let's dive deeper. Let's go a little bit more multidimensional with it. Now, that is one phrase. Ruler is one way of describing archons. Now, there is an occult reference to archons, and maybe a lot of y'all have heard about the archons, okay? I think a lot of y'all have to even be drawn to this content that I'm sharing. So, let's look at the occult definition of an archon. Archons in Gnosticism are believed to be celestial beings responsible for creating and maintaining the physical universe, and are seen as obstacles to spiritual enlightenment. They are often depicted as powerful, malevolent, and deceitful beings that try to keep humanity trapped in the physical world. Okay, archons are not humans, all right, but archons are rulers, extra-dimensional, multidimensional rulers, quote unquote, which control humanity, controls the outcome of humanity. So you might even say that maybe they are the architects of the false matrix simulation that we are in. Now let's go back to W.E.B. Du Bois's concept of double consciousness. Here's W.E.B. Du Bois, this quote, radical civil rights activist who is writing about the perils of racism and basically the pain that it has caused to the Black American soul and creating a sense of double consciousness, all right? Meanwhile, W.E.B. Du Bois has his own form of double consciousness where he is a member of a very elite secret society funded by the same white power structures that he is critiquing. And on top of that, he is an archon, okay? And that could be within the Greek word of ruler, But maybe some might say that there was some kind of a connection, an archonic connection, for him to even be able to have the access to found a chapter of the Boule, a very elite secret society, and to be able to have access to a lot of the opportunities that Du Bois had access to. So this just kind of gets us into a different framework of double consciousness, okay? So let's go a little bit more in depth, because I started this particular segment discussing the sacred marriage between the right and the left brain hemispheres. Okay, we're still on that topic, I promise. So let's talk a little bit more about these archons and how what is known as archonic deception behavior, how that's been utilized to keep us in this split double consciousness. Okay, so I'm now reading from Ascension Glossary. So Ascension Glossary describes archonic deception behavior in a few ways: disassociation and narcissism, mental rigidity, emotional fracturing, carelessness, deceit, dependence, false reality delusions, and divided competition. Okay, so that's how Ascension Glossary defines archonic deception behavior. Now, there are also some archonic deception strategies which are mentioned through Ascension Glossary, including divide and conquer, victim, victimizer, sexual abuse and misery, child abuse and child sacrifice, and misogyny. Now, that's what Ascension Glossary would say. I would also add some kind of like racism as well. Some might argue that would fall under the umbrella of like victim, victimizer, or sexual abuse and misery, like that kind of thing. But, because misogyny was also mentioned, I would add that. Or I would even just add anything that, even beyond racism and misogyny, anything that, that keeps people feeling less than. So that could also include ableism, right? That could also include any kind of disregard for a person's humanity, and all of the isms that can be included within that umbrella. So this is a part of the archonic deception strategy, okay? And the thing that we need to know about how the archons operate is they operate through the middle part of our brain. So the middle part of our brain, which I'll be speaking to in more depth, is something called the corpus callosum, okay? Now, the corpus callosum is within that middle part of our brain, or it's also called the midbrain. That is where the sacredness of our divine mind actually lies. The thing about it is that in order to access the sacredness of our divine mind, it requires a great deal of deprogramming and healing from mind control. This is why you'll see on my platform that I go so in depth with etheric implant removal and healing mind control, religious programming, etc., because a lot was done to basically keep us in a delusion of double consciousness, double-mindedness, polarity-based consciousness, so that we didn't learn to activate our divine mind, or that we didn't see ourselves as being divine, okay? So the midpoint is the sacred marriage. But because that also rules our pleasure and rewards centers, this is also what's been utilized to control humanity as well. So here's a very old article from the Science Correspondent in September 2011. It says, scientists find they can control how people react to group pressure. Scientists have identified the part of the brain responsible for controlling whether we conform to expectations and group pressure. The researchers found that they were able to control whether volunteers conformed to social pressure by using powerful electromagnetic pulses that change the activity of a small part of the brain. Volunteers whose posterior medial frontal cortex, an area in the middle of the brain, so this could also be referred to as the corpus callosum, that is associated with reward processing, were exposed to the magnetic pulses, suffered reduced levels of conformity. Okay, so I want you to keep that term magnetic in your mind because we're going to go back to that actually. So essentially, they utilized electromagnetic frequencies within this study and found that they were able to have some people be less susceptible to hive mind or groupthink through the utilization of these electromagnetic pulses. So keep magnetic in your mind because we're going to go back to that. It says the researchers believe this part of the brain dates back a long way in the evolution of animals and is responsible or automatically correcting our performance when we fall out of line with the group. Okay, so something about mind control happens within the middle part of our brain. However, we also know that the divine marriage can be found in the middle part of our brain as well. Now, I'm going to actually talk a little bit more about the midbrain, also known as the corpus callosum. So there was a Nobel Peace Prize winner by the name of Makoto Shishida. I don't know if I pronounced that right, but he is the founder of something called the midbrain activation, and he was a professor in Japan. All right, and so he spent 40 years of research to develop this method he called midbrain activation. So it says midbrain is situated below the cerebral cortex and above the hindbrain, between the left brain and the right brain. So this is interesting to note because essentially the midbrain not only is in the middle between the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, but it's also closely associated with our brain stem. And what is our brain stem closely associated with? Our spine. And now we're kind of getting into this whole thing around where our chakras are and where Kundalini is supposed to flow as well. And one thing we know about Kundalini for folks who have been on the spiritual path is that the activation of your Kundalini is also the activation of your divinity as well. Okay, and that there are a lot of obstructions as it relates to genuinely activating our Kundalini. And a lot of this is as a result of mind control, archonic deceptions, strategies, as well as etheric implants. Okay. So, but the thing about this professor's work is he actually focused on this thing called midbrain activation to support children to become kind of like super children in a way. So his particular research showed parents how they could get their children to become way more high performing than the average child through the activation of the middle part of their brains. Now, I'm not quite sure why he specified children as it relates to this. Maybe it was because, I think I do remember that there's a certain developmental point when you're younger where you're able to kind of train your brain a bit more. But I would assume that this would also still be very beneficial for adults as well. It says the midbrain activation allows the whole brain to be utilized instead of one part of the brain. Whole utilization of the brain helps children to develop imagination and visualization power. It makes them emotionally strong. After activation, a child can identify colors, numbers, pictures, etc. with closed eyes by using their other senses. Okay, so this sounds like it's not just about them becoming smarter, but it's also about them becoming more psychic. Almost like they're activating their divine mind, maybe. Okay, so this is kind of interesting. So one thing that they stated about some of the findings is that the midbrain activation improved creativity, imagination, self-confidence. It enhanced concentration, improved memory, enhanced absorption capabilities, emotional stability, and effective balancing of the left and right brain. Now, these are all things that would, if we were able to activate these things, this would lead us into a greater sense of embodied divinity. Okay, this midbrain activation. However, at the same time, the middle part of our brains, the pleasure and reward center of our brain, is what's also utilized to cultivate groupthink, hive mind, and mind control, getting people to follow the herd, okay, to not step out of line. Is this making sense at all? All right. So our biggest place of power is also the most manipulated. This is how the false matrix simulation works. It will always, I always talk about this to folks I work with in client coaching sessions. The false matrix is always going to use your greatest strength and make you think it's a weakness. It's going to look like it's your greatest weakness in the simulation. This is a part of the inversion. This is why we need to reverse the spell of the false matrix simulation. So a lot of us are walking around thinking that that we're really bad at something, or that something in our lives always fails. But 9 times out of 10, it is that failure, it is that biggest weak spot, quote unquote, that you have, which is your place of power. You've just been programmed to think that it's your weakness so that you stay out of your divinity. Okay, so the same concept goes for sacred marriage between our right hemisphere and our left hemisphere. Our place of power is our wholeness, is embodying wholeness and unity consciousness. But at the same time, that unity consciousness is going to seem to be locked through many different mind control matrices as well as etheric implants, so that it's going to seem like it's impossible for us to embody the all, or to unify, or have that sacred marriage from within, and also to have that sacred marriage from without as well. But we need to start within. Okay, so if your goal is to have that sacred divine partner, what sacred divine partnership do you have within yourself? What polarity-based thought forms are you holding within yourself? Okay, so we want to start there, and we want to embody the sacred marriage. We've been taught so much within this false matrix system to look outside of ourselves to be completed. And this is what keeps us out of our power. Okay, so the true unification of the divine masculine and the divine feminine is always going to happen within us first. And it's going to happen through activating our corpus callosum, our midbrain. Okay, getting out of all archonic deception strategies, or as W.E.B. Du Bois referred to it, double consciousness. Okay, and he knew it very well. He was a civil rights activist who was all power to the people on one hand, but on the other hand, he was also an archon. So he knew double consciousness quite well. And this is why he is so well known for a book called The Souls of Black Folk. Okay, because he saw this as not way more than just being a construct as it relates to physical embodiment. This was a soul thing. All right. So he was a civil rights activist. So in a lot of ways, he spoke to a very visceral, physical kind of differences that people experienced in society. Race is a very physical kind of thing, right? But he didn't just talk about race. He talked about the soul of the division that race caused through this double consciousness. Okay. But I would venture to say that it went way deeper than just race for W.E.B. Du Bois. Okay. He was in his own particular spiritual war or spiritual double-mindedness. Okay. But in order for us to truly embody our true soul essence, we must leave double consciousness in the old paradigm and move into embodying wholeness. All right. I hope y'all are following me. So I'm going to add another layer now. All right. Just to sum things up, we started off with talking about polarity-based thought forms, how this creates a double consciousness, and how this double consciousness, this polarity, competitive, us versus them behavior, keeps us in the simulation, keeps us out of our divinity, keeps us out of alignment with sacred marriage. And the way that we activate sacred marriage from within is through activating the middle parts of our brain, also known as the corpus callosum or the midbrain. In the midbrain is where our divinity lies. This is why our pleasure centers are also here. Our pleasure and reward centers are here, because in its highest vibration, this would give us joy. This would give us this divine spark and this divinity. However, as an archonic deception strategy, it has been utilized in the false matrix in order to keep us in a state of fear. And this has been done through herd mentality, hive mind mentality. This is how the media has been utilized a lot, through the midbrain, through our pleasure and reward centers. This is how a lot of peer pressure has happened, how we've been conditioned by society as it relates to peer pressure from a very early age. If we get out of alignment too much with what is considered the norm, then we get chastised. We get out of alignment with pleasure and reward, okay? And we're ostracized, okay? So this huge place of power where we activate our divine mind, which is the midbrain, the corpus callosum, has been used against us in the false matrix simulation, because this is the way things go. Our strength will always be used as our biggest weakness as long as we stay in this slavery-based construct of the false matrix simulation. This is why we must exit. No matter how you identify in society, you're still impacted by this, okay, one way or another. All right. What do magnets have to do with this? Well, how am I going to tie magnets into this? Stay with me. Follow me. Drink your tea, your lovely beverage. I'm going to take a sip of, I'm like actually drinking coffee. Very caffeinated for this conversation. Magnets. What do magnets have to do with this? Okay. In 1992, researchers identified the presence of magnetite, a permanently magnetic form of iron oxide, in human brain tissue. Iron in the body was no surprise. It is commonly found in ferritin, an intracellular protein common to several organisms, and the magnetite was thought to have formed biogenically, with some possibly originating in ferritin. But the presence of magnetite in the brain could be more than incidental. Various studies have shown that brain cells respond to external magnetic fields. There's also a disturbing link to neurodegenerative disease. Evidence exists of elevated levels of magnetite in brain tissue from Alzheimer's disease patients. Okay, we're going to go back to that. Let's learn a little bit more about magnetite in our bodies and in our minds. In humans, magnetite is found in the brain. Okay, we talked about that. The heart. You know how people say that the heart is in an electromagnetic field? Okay, because magnetite is in our heart, apparently. Liver and spleen. So I'm going to repeat that. In humans, magnetite is found in the brain, heart, liver, and spleen. Now, one thing about the spleen, I mentioned this in, if y'all are interested in learning more about the way our chakras have been manipulated in the false matrix simulation, I do have a chakra education playlist on my platform that you can check out. I did a segment on the spleen chakra, and in that segment, I went into depth around how the spleen is not something that we talk about a lot in Western medicine, even though it's extremely important. It's where our chi, our prana, our life force energy comes from, is through our spleen. And yet we get very little education about our spleen in Western medicine. Chinese medicine does a much better job of educating folks on the spleen and making sure that we get our spleen taken care of. I find it really interesting that there are magnets in our spleen. It says humans suffer from memory dysfunctions in many cases when iron is out of balance. Anomalous concentrations of magnetite is known to be associated with a neurodegenerative disorder like Alzheimer's disease. Okay. Now, I've been knowing this for a minute, that magnetite was in our brains, that the heart had the electromagnetic field. The magnets in the spleen and liver is actually newer information for me. I knew that there were etheric implants there, but I didn't know magnets were there. I mentioned this in some of the content that I have done previously or more recently around this concept of false magnetism. So if this is piquing your interest, check out the content I've done on false magnetism. I mentioned in that content that, a lot of times in like the new age spiritual circles, we're taught to think that magnetism is great. Yes, we want more magnetism. Let's magnetize our dreams. Let's magnetize our goals. The law of attraction, magnet. Let's be a magnet, okay? But something I've been kind of breaking down in some of my recent content is this concept of false magnetism, okay? That sometimes magnets are utilized against us in this false matrix system, all right? One thing I mentioned in the Uncross Yourself presentation download that I did was this concept around the false matrix being held up by a series of magnets and mirrors, okay? And these magnets and mirrors sometimes are utilized to deflect energy, and kind of do this whole like weird copycat energy. The mirrors can be utilized as like more of a copycat sort of energy, deflecting things that maybe aren't ours onto other people. And then another thing is magnets can be utilized to siphon energy. All right. And this is kind of how like sometimes like destiny swapping can happen, or dream brokering, as it's called in the unconscious, can happen, is through this concept of false magnetism. Okay. So, there could be an argument that says, okay, well, maybe magnets in our brains are good. Maybe they help us. But I find it really interesting that they're saying that higher amounts of magnetite in the brain can lead to a very neurodegenerative disorder like Alzheimer's, which is it's not good for the brain at all. It's the opposite of good, as it gets us out of alignment with the divine mind. All right. And so I want to reiterate something I shared about false magnetism once more. And I want to say that if you are, interested in this concept, definitely get some magnetite. I do think magnetite is really powerful, and it's something that I have known to be very healing. I've done a lot of manifestation placing magnetite, for example, on my heart space and on my brain space. Actually, I was in a really deep karmic loop a few years back and place some magnetite on my, and this is all kind of coming to me in this moment. I'm all putting it together right now. Place some magnetite right at the middle of my head, actually. I was wearing a head wrap, so I was able to like stick the magnetite in there and was able to manifest so quickly something that was taking me forever to do. And I thought like, oh, it's because I'm becoming magnetic. But one thing that I have shared in other content that I've done is that in order to combat false magnetism, you cancel the magnet. You have to cancel the magnet, and sometimes you need to cancel one magnetic charge with another magnetic charge. And so now, looking at this full circle, I realized I was canceling the magnet and even the where I put the magnet at. And that was able to interrupt the karmic loop of loss. And I was able to manifest something I was trying to manifest for so long, and was able to do it in an instant once I placed the magnetite there. I also did that in my heart space and had some really big gains. So I've mentioned it before and I'll mention it again. Magnetite has been utilized in a way to, or magnetism has been utilized in a way to thwart you. But then you want to use, just like the false matrix does, you want to use what has been your biggest weakness and turn it into your biggest strength. You see how that gets us in alignment with the divine mind? It cancels, the positive cancels the negative out. It gets us into that state of wholeness. Okay. So this is why, just like I mentioned about mirrors can be utilized as a weapon to keep you trapped in the false matrix, but it can also be your gateway out. Same for magnets. Okay. So I'm going to stop there. All right. There is going to be some content. I'll be sharing a midbrain activation on the Patreon. So if you're interested in this concept of sacred marriage and polarity integration, check out the Patreon. There's also just a lot of different content as it relates to polarity integration and clearing polarity thought forms, clearing etheric implants. If you are on that path to exiting the simulation and you are looking for somebody to support you on this path, then definitely reach out to me. I am booking right now for 2025 as it relates to different coaching journeys. So right now I offer 6-week coaching journeys, 3-month coaching journeys, 9-month coaching journeys. I'm actually starting a 1-year individual coaching journey in 2025 where it's inclusive of an in-person retreat with me, as well as a year of coaching and deprogramming and activating your latent divine gifts and potential. Okay. So if this is something that you're seeking some support with, then reach out to me. I think I might have one more spot for 2024, but I'm mainly booking for 2025. So definitely reach out to me. Sending you lots of love on your journey. Know that you are the key. Until we meet again. Bye.